Hello. Today we're going to talk about the concept of a level playing field, what that means in the context of geopolitics and our money system, and why is it important for those of you who have been in the XRP and kind of crypto world for a long time and are about to experience life-changing wealth situations. What are the humanitarian and even ethical obligations that you have as a result of that wealth? So we're going to break that down in today's show. Hey, welcome to the show. Molly here. Today we're going to talk about the level playing field and a specific series that I am working on. I've already started about a level playing field for the nations of Africa. So I first learned about level playing field from a speech that Donald Trump gave. And he has mentioned, when Trump speaks, he often speaks in kind of coded languages. He isn't always talking directly to kind of the citizens. He's often talking to the adversaries that he is challenging. And those are the incumbent, the swamp or, the cabal or these kind of elites of the world, this very, very small group of people who have controlled like the majority of wealth and have implemented money systems and taxation systems globally to keep themselves benefiting and the vast majority of people not, and huge populations of people, particularly in places like Africa, are in destitute poverty unnecessarily, in my opinion. So we now have this opportunity to be a part of a life-changing kind of paradigm shift in global geopolitics, where we are watching the fall of the fiat money system, which has been used to manipulate and control people everywhere. I'm only going to really speak to our lifetime for most of this conversation. But like since we were little, we've lived in this dollar system that was not backed by assets. Even if you are outside the United States, because global trade has been done in dollars since the 70s, it has been the system that has been used as a mechanism to control everybody. But we're fortunate in that we are watching the collapse of that. You can see that these fiat currencies, particularly the reserve currencies like the dollar and the euro, are being inflated to the point where it really wasn't smart to be a saver of dollars. Like if you had $20,000 back, 1970 in a savings account, and you got your 0.01 interest from the bank or whatever, you didn't really make all that much money. The wealth in this world has been in the assets game. Real estate, owning companies, owning entities that generate cash flow, gold, minerals, things that are useful or have been considered money for a long time are really where we've seen a lot of appreciation in wealth. Fiat currencies have been inflating away, meaning what you could buy with $1 20 years ago is certainly not what you can buy with $1 today. It's almost comical, if you can look at it that way, to go to a grocery store and sort of see how ridiculously expensive things are that used to be actually quite inexpensive. So this brings us to this geopolitical issue that if we are moving to a world where assets are money, and if you watched, and you've seen in my previous videos, I have talked about the difference between the US corporation and republics. So we're watching a shift away from these colonial structures. Even if you were a colony that was, quote, liberated, and I'm including the United States in this discussion, not everything was necessarily as liberated as you might think. That the corporate structure was still in place, which means there are shareholders, there are profits that are distributed to those shareholders, and there are assets on the asset book, on the balance sheet. And in many cases, the citizens of these countries are assets on the balance sheet. We learned this a couple years ago, and I've done a video on this if you want to look it up, with the North American Water and Power Alliance, where they had a $14 quadrillion lien, which is like they printed this money, and the collateral for that was people, the citizens of the United States. And, we took that to mean that our tax paying potential is our earning power. So we are cash flowing assets for the despicable managers of these corporations. Now, lots of people, fortunately, are aware of how this was done in the United States. There's now a movement to create republics for each of the 50 states. and issue their own gold-backed currencies. What kind of came to my attention, and Jimmy and I talked about this many times over the last couple of years, is what's going to happen to the countries of the world that are rich in resources, but don't have like a whole bunch of people who are familiar with blockchain technology and how to tokenize those assets and how to kind of flip the script on this rigged game. So for many years now, at least two, since I started doing publications about asset-backed currencies, I've felt very driven to help African nations kind of get out of this last yoke of colonialism and be sovereign entities. So I'm not one of these people who thinks I'm going to go into Africa and like solve everyone's problems. I just know that the money game has been rigged, and the more countries that can break free of that rigged system, the greater the odds that they will actually succeed and be prosperous. Related to that, as we move to this world of asset-backed money, it is extremely likely that gold will be revalued to a much, much higher degree. Silver as well, but we're going to just talk about gold for right now. And so if you go from $2,000 an ounce to $1 million an ounce, just I don't know what it's going to be revalued to. I'll explain to you in a second why I'm pretty confident on that. All of a sudden, countries that have like a pretty decent amount of gold in terms of wealth are going to be abundantly wealthy. And while that sounds cool, what that could mean is that the vultures come in and they try to take that wealth and they try to create mechanisms that maybe look like they're good for the people, but they're really just a big old bait and switch. And so the more we openly talk about these things, the more we help people in sovereign countries that have these types of resources before this happens, like you got to understand the game and how you can take control of the value of these resources via property rights so that the citizens of the country can benefit from them for once and not have a recreation of what we've seen in the past. So, okay, why do I think gold will be revalued? For well over a decade, central banks around the world have been stockpiling gold. They release this information via press releases, and the sort of like gold industry publications pick it up. So you can Google them though, and they're all over Twitter. And so it's been clear that gold has a purpose, or else why would central banks around the world have been stockpiling it? Two, the Bank of International Settlements, which is kind of considered the central bank of central banks, relabeled gold a tier one asset a couple of years ago. Like, why do that if gold is just some relic for jewelry and industrial purposes? It's because it has been anticipated for quite some time that the fiat money system will collapse. And after that happens, people will not have faith in fiat money. So they will have to introduce new sovereign currencies that are backed by gold. Makes a lot of sense. Now, there are many countries that don't have any gold. And there are countries that have like militaries that don't have gold. So if all of a sudden gold becomes worth tons more, I would be fearful that if I didn't have some rock solid contracts in place that would prevent my gold from being given away, that there's a vulnerability there. And I've spent the last couple of weeks reading quite a few books about history of Africa and colonialism and how the European colonizers set up this rigged game. And it's actually, it kind of bummed me. I mean, reading some of these stories about stuff that happened is just horrifying. And I can't understand why anyone could be justify the colonial systems that were in place. Particularly, like the most despicable one I have found so far would be King Leopold II of Belgium, who decided in the late 1800s that the Congo was just going to be his own personal asset, and he decided he owned it, and that meant he owned all the people there. And there, at the time, the major industries were ivory and rubber. I'm no fan of the ivory industry. I think that should be considered unethical and illegal and unlawful in every culture. There is no rationalization for why you need to make little sculptures out of elephant tusks. Like, go make them out of clay or go dig up a big rock if you need to make some sculptures. You don't need to kill elephants for their trunk to make sculpture, artwork or whatever. Same thing with shark fin soup. Those two things, like, you will never convince me that there is any rational justification for either of those things. Okay. King Leopold II got this industry with ivory and rubber and did horrible things where he just really had no value for human life. And if Congolese people who were slaves and forced to work in these rubber plantations. If you didn't meet your quota for the day, they like chopped off your hands. I mean, absolute brutal stuff that you can't possibly have respect for human life and engage in that kind of behavior. So I'm happy for the people of Africa. We'll talk about the Congolese right now that were liberated in around 1960 from this Belgian rule. And the Belgians had this kind of arrogant attitude that, they had done all these great things for the Congolese. And, it was surprising that they didn't want to remain a colony forever. But I can imagine if my hands were chopped off or I'd been whipped, I'd be pretty unforgiving for the road that you built in spite of all of this torture stuff. So there's a history of these sort of European oligarchs kind of coming into Africa and treating it like land and resources that they can just take with little consequence. So what's less clear, though, and this is where it ties into those US corporation stuff, is when these Europeans left, they gave this illusion of, and I'm not to the bottom of this, and I'm certainly not an expert on it, so please don't interpret it that way. I'm still learning about this. But when, the French and the Congolese and the British the Belgians left, they may have said, all right, now you can have your own elections and have your own leaders and have your own parliaments. But who now owns the corporations that were set up under these colonial structures? The Dutch East India Company was kind of one of the original trade groups it's a company that was in the global trade world where they were kind of going from Europe over to sometimes West Indies, sometimes the East Indies, hence the names, to get spices and resources and whatever stuff they wanted. And so they set up these colonies, and that's what South Africa was of particular interest because of its gold and its location on the trade routes, right, to go from Europe around over to Asia. So colonies were part of this business. Like they owned those assets. And so if King Leopold owned Congo in his mind, and then because of basically people saying that was unethical, and I haven't figured out the whole story when he basically was forced to kind of cede it to the Belgian government, what that literally meant in terms of the contracts. And now did the Belgian government really own the land now, or did something retain in the asset balance sheet of King Leopold II? Same thing with when the French left the sort of states that are now on the CFA franc, which I'm going to do a whole separate video on. France had a whole bunch of colonies too, and they've not been good to those citizens either. And when the countries demanded independence and they were granted that independence, I'm still not clear whether everything was ceded in terms of the property rights of the land and the resources. Because what's unclear to me is that if a country has a president, this guy just say some guy just gets elected on, in June, how does he really have the legal authority to grant mineral rights and oil rights to a company? If the citizens of the country really own that land, when you vote for an elected official, are you really giving them permission to grant those rights without you as the citizen voting on that at an per instance level? This is where this stuff gets interesting, and understanding of what property rights are and who really owns these countries is important, because I think that the vision of the future is to have a lot of independent republics where the land is owned by the citizens of that republic. And when resources are sold, the citizens receive royalties on it. In the same way that, imagine if it was like a family of 5 people who own a business and the business makes money, each family member could receive royalties on that. That's not a strange thing to do at a small level. It gets to be complicated when you get to a macro level, when all of a sudden people now start referring to it as like welfare or whatever. No, I mean, the uber wealthy have lived off royalties for many, many centuries. So it makes a lot of sense for the citizens of the world who have as much of a right to those assets as King Leopold's descendants who just walked in one day and decided to take it from people who were already living there. Same thing, this has happened around the world, a lot of places. So I realize this is a Pandora's box to open. So we're just going to focus today on some of the Africa topics around the level playing field. So the point I'm trying to make is understanding who actually owns these countries, particularly if they were former colonies, Were the actual property rights ceded to the citizens? If so, why is citizen approval not needed when rights for something like oil or mineral drilling are sold off to a Western corporation? Great questions. I feel like we should have these discussions more. Because when gold becomes substantially worth more, this is going to be a problem because you're going to have leaders come in, Western companies come into the leaders, offer them a whole lot of money, and we're going to see this continued problem where the very, very tiny elites who are chosen by the Western banking cartel, these European oligarchs, they chose their leaders, and then the rest of the country remains destitute and in poverty. And it doesn't have to be this way, because what's going to end up happening is you create like a pressure cooker where at some point the rest of the world is going to be fed up with this tiny, tiny percentage who've been taking advantage and exploiting everyone else, and we're going to have a World War III situation. I've covered the BRICS alliance many times on this show and on Twitter, and I really strongly believe that the BRICS coalition are former colonies, producing states, those who have assets and people who actually work to create products, like in China, who are tired of the Western banking cartel who owns the dollar system, where they can print dollars out of nothing and buy whatever they want. It's like having daddy's credit card that you never have to pay the bill. You just buy whatever you want, where everybody else in the world has to work for their money. And it's just not fair. It's a rigged game. And so the concept of a level playing field is to create a global economy where every nation has a shot at prosperity. And if you have a problem with this, it means you got to get better at whatever it is you do. And there's a lot of bad people who have been in charge of countries and the money system, and they need to be removed from positions of authority. And I have a very simple litmus test on whether or not you're a bad guy or bad person. If in the pursuit of your own wealth and success, you have to harm people or exploit them or kill them or harm them in any way, then you need to find something else to do. I mean, it's the basic law across every religion, spirituality is do no harm. Go live your life, be successful, or pursue whatever dreams you want to do, but you can't hurt people along the way. Otherwise, you will incur a karmic debt, you'll go to jail, you're not a good guy. So as we see this shift towards asset-backed systems, all of us need to embrace the fact that to be good citizens of this planet, you have to live your own life and not harm people. It also means you can't always turn a blind eye to the harm that is happening around you. And we have seen that Western companies, a lot of oil companies and mineral companies, they go into African nations where there's a lot of resources and they exploit what they want. They poison the water supply. They leave, they destroy farmland. They leave these sort of empty mines that have destroyed the ability to use and live on that land. And they don't really seem to act terribly responsible for that. They're just like, hey, business is business. And I don't think that that is part of our new world that we're entering, where if you are going to be in the mineral and gold business, you need to figure out a way to do it that you're not going to be harmful to people. And it also needs to benefit the citizens of that land via royalty payments. So in my research recently, I've read quite a few stories about leaders in Angola and Nigeria who have gotten really sweet deals from these kind of Western and now Chinese mining and drilling companies. And there is no systems in place to ensure that that money actually benefits the people at all. And it's sad because there's so much wealth and abundance on this planet, but it's being hoarded by a very, very small group of people who I don't understand how they sleep at night. My most logical conclusion is a lot of them are demonically possessed and they just are not capable of empathy and compassion and having the need to be a good person, because I don't know how else you could justify and rationalize some of the things that have been done. So for places like Africa, to bring to light the fact that corporate structures can be set up for new republics, when we see all of the world switch that, where the citizens are given profit sharing or royalties to the resources that are being sold, and that money can be used to teach people skills, teach people how to do things like build houses and be plumbers and electricians, so that those who are living in conditions that are just unhealthy because There's disease when you don't have running water and basic sanitation. And it's hard to, start your own business or be a provider for your family if you don't have any skills. And learning, English in school is probably not as practical as learning how to, uh, you know, build things or make things that could be turned into a business for your family. I know I'm very pro small business, and I don't think that small business life is the path for everyone. But I have seen in small communities where I have lived that there's a real pride in being a small business owner and, creating products and even services that the rest of the people in your community appreciate. And in turn, they do the same for you. You kind of create this cottage industry type environment. And there's a sense of pride and happiness from being a thriving part of a community that's prosperous and successful. And sometimes that just happens from allowing the school systems to teach practical skills, allowing, business owners to teach others. And I'm kind of rambling on about this for now, but the point is I've started this series and there's a bunch of infographics that will accompany it where we're going to break down like what are all the issues that, in this case, we're going to do Africa first. I'll do other regions of the world after. What are the specific issues that Africa is facing and how can blockchain technology and tokenization and this new concept of assets being money be used to benefit the people of Africa? Now, I'm not also going to tell African countries what they should or should not want to do. I'm just going to say, here's how I have found that the game is rigged. If you want to end up on the other side of this rigged game and basically have an advantage by at least knowing how it works, this is what we have figured out. And these are the types of mechanisms you can put in place to prevent these kind of oligarchy of sorts from coming back again and cherry picking a couple of people who they're in their pocket, putting those people into positions of power, and then using that to exploit the masses. Like that kind of stuff can end if everybody's aware of the game and we spot it because, it's not a new game and they've been doing it for centuries. But we are alive at a very exciting time in history. Now, those of us who have been in the XRP world for a long time are aware that we're very close to a flip the switch type moment. And many of us are going to be in a position where we are stewards of capital that can be deployed to benefit humanity. So one of my humanitarian projects is to help African countries monetize their assets to create sovereign currencies that are backed by those assets so they don't have to be beholden to the Western banking system. The CFA franc is a great example. These 14 countries in Western Africa have to pay France tons of money in reserves to have currency issued for them, that those resources could be better deployed to benefit the people and not the French treasury. That's just one example. There's going to be many of them to show that the Africa, like the former colonies, now we're going to do a Canada one, we'll do an Australia one, a US one. All of these former colonies are exploited in some way. We're just going to focus on Africa first. So this is my intro to that. The first infographic and thread I did the other day is about this concept called Dutch disease, which isn't really like an illness. It's basically the unfortunate consequences of being in an economy where a large amount of wealth or money comes in from the discovery of a natural resource, and it kind of creates more problems than solutions. So in the case of the Netherlands, back in I think 1950s, 1959, a whole bunch of natural gas was discovered in the North Sea, and all this new money came in. And when you had new money coming in that was foreign currency and had to be converted to the Dutch guilder, I think it was at the time, and it basically increased the value of the Dutch currency, which meant that imports were cheaper because now the Dutch currency could buy more stuff in other currencies. But unfortunately, the Dutch also had a lot of stuff they exported. And those industries were now less competitive because their stuff was too expensive. It also created problems in that the focus was not really on developing other industries when all this money was coming in from the oil thing. So this was labeled by The Economist in 1977 as Dutch disease. And now we've seen that this same thing happens in a lot of African nations, like Nigeria and Angola are great examples where the economy was pretty like flat, and all of a sudden all this oil money now flows in, but it's only going to a very small group of people. But that small group of people now buy a whole bunch of stuff, and that currency that it was bought in, which is probably dollars, gets converted to local currency so that now the the Nigerian or the Angolan currency becomes worth more. So now these other industries can't export, and there isn't any focus now on by the government on developing these other industries because they're just fat cats sitting pretty with all their oil money. And the vast majority of the citizens of these two countries in this example have not benefited from all this oil wealth. So it's like the country might have been better off if there had never been oil discovered in the world. There's a lot of great memes that happened when I think it was the Uganda gold was discovered, or the president of Uganda spoke about it at a press conference, that people were worried pretty quickly that all of a sudden, the Western mining interests are going to come in to help save the Ugandans from, these problems, which means they're just going to steal the gold and create the same issues via Dutch disease, or also known as the resource curse, that happen. So this can be avoided, though, if with smart leadership and ethical, honorable leadership, where the money is not just being stolen essentially by this very small group of elites, but if it's instead put into a sovereign wealth fund that can be used transparently to benefit the citizens. That money can also be used to develop industries. So one of the challenges with Africa is a lot of resources are sort of mined or extracted on the continent, but then they're pretty much immediately exported to somewhere else for processing. There's a lot of money in the processing. So lithium is a great example. Quite a bit of lithium comes from the Congo. Most comes from Australia and Chile, but Congo has a lot of lithium that could be life-changing for that region, but it gets exported right away to China because there's no lithium processing factory in Congo. So if the money from these resources went into a sovereign wealth fund, which was used to develop a mine. Maybe the mine is owned by Congolese people, employs Congolese people. The sort of processed lithium can then be sold on the market at a much higher rate, meaning a larger share of the value of this lithium would then go to the people of the Congo and wouldn't simply be benefiting the mining companies and the Chinese who are now processing it. So those are types of examples of what I'm talking about. Instead of all of a sudden, I used to have this soap making business years ago, and we would buy cocoa butter and shea butter from Africa, and it was way less expensive than if you bought, shea butter soap, right? Because these are the sort of raw components. And if you were to be in the business of selling shea butter or selling products made with shea butter, you're going to make more revenue from the products because you're charging a higher price for them. Now, there's other considerations like labor and packaging and all that stuff. So that's kind of a complicated subject. But the point is that there's a reason why the wealthier countries produce the finished product and aren't in the natural resource business, because you don't get as much money for commodities. There's a lot of price fluctuation and a lot of price competition, which means that the producers of the commodities are often getting the minimum amount of money they can get because of these sort of market conditions, where if they were processing these raw ingredients in country and producing products, more people get employed, higher revenue. It just benefits the people to a greater degree. So we'll talk about that in this series as well. So we're going to cover the level playing field for Africa first and break down why it's in all of our interests. We don't want to experience World War III, and you're just an ethical person and want to stop seeing the exploitation of people who certainly don't deserve it. Then stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next one.